Great. All right, hello. This is still your friend Riley from Los Angeles, and I am talking to Roby Johnson. I don't know if I said your last name in the first video, but in case anybody, not that it helps find you. You have a last name like me, Smith and Johnson. It does not narrow it down if someone is trying to search for us. It is not a helpful last name. We are now jumping into, in the first part of the interview, we did a delightful primer for you of what is immersive theater and what are some of the best things and problems about the genre right now. I think, like most things in life, the things that are most wonderful about it are also the most inconvenient, and we talked with Roby a little bit about that. But now I really want to hone in on one area of Roby's expertise that I think is particularly interesting and important, actually, for just all performers and all performer practitioners, anybody who's writing anything for people to be a part of and view, and that's audience consent. And talking about how do we make things better for the people who are watching us. But before I conflate things that shouldn't be conflated, my first question for you, so my experience of dealing with an audience is very much dealing with one block of energy, and we talked about this a little bit already, but there's a unity there. You're kind of a being, like an improv, I feel like I am a being communing with another being, and it feels like one entity who is communing, connecting, talking with me when I engage with an audience. How does this change in immersive, and in what ways is it similar to what you termed in your thesis the choreographic landscape? If you want to unpack that term for us a little bit. And
totally. I'm actually glad you brought that up, because that's exactly where I was going to go.
I did my homework.
Yeah, so choreographic landscape, oh my gosh, I don't know why I'm blanking on what scholar came up with that. It's not my original idea. It came from another scholar, but I did kind of adapt it a little bit. So for me, the choreographic landscape is a way of approaching audiences as a performer or as a practitioner or creator, both as something, a group that has agency, but also something that is part of this environment that you're creating, and something that has to be moved or worked around. And so I think a great example is to go off of something that we did in Safe House 82, which is a fight scene, right? So with a fight scene in traditional theater, you have your actors, you stage it correctly, you make it look as real as possible while keeping your actors safe. You don't go 100%, you go 70. We have all these techniques and tools and sleight of hand way of making it appear real. That's great. In immersive theater, that can be really, really tricky, especially if you have a crowd of people. And so, one of the challenges with immersive theater, especially because you want it to be intimate, is that, what if you have a couple of actors break out into a fight in a group of people? Well, you have to be really careful about that, because we want to protect the audience. And so this is where approaching the audience as a choreographic landscape can really help. What we did in Safe House, for example, is that we had this fight break out as our entire audience was coming from a mass briefing that they had in the back. So they were all together. They were coming into the new space, back into like this living room area. And so already it was kind of carved out. So, we didn't have to move people around so much. That being said, we were able to use kind of our actors as sort of like human obstacles, to kind of keep people from entering that area, but doing so in a way that didn't seem very obvious, right? Or if, you know, someone happens to somehow find their way around the actors and kind of be in the living room area where this fight was about to happen, an actor would not have hesitated to have told that person to get back.
Right.
We had a great inciting moment where, you know, this actor initiating the fight pulls a knife, right? And so all the other actors can suddenly tell people, oh, back up, back up, back up, right?
Right, because it's literally like in game, you're like, get back for your safety because I'm a spy and you're a spy and it's not safe. But also it's like literally get back though because we're trying to do a fight scene. So the direction
Exactly.
works on both levels.
Exactly. And just like the actors have to be aware of environmental hazards, like, you know, they were flipping over a sofa and had to make sure not to hit a coffee table. And there was like a door slam. Like, the audience in that moment was also an environmental hazard, and we had to shape the landscape appropriately, choreograph those people into position so that way the fight scene would go uninterrupted. But of course, that's just a fight scene.
Right.
Choreographic landscape, that can be used in other ways too. If you're trying to get an audience to move somewhere, you can lead the audience in that way. In Strange Bird Immersive's The Man from Beyond, the fortune teller, she leads you to a main seance space after you've kind of been introduced to her and she reads your fortunes a little bit. She uses a candelabra as well as this kind of like guiding gestures to guide you down this hallway, where there's also like a rules briefing that takes place. But in that way, she, in very clear points, uses her body to obstruct the path, get people to stop, or encourage people to move forward.
Right.
And so you really have the ability to choreograph the audience to do a movement or an action that's important for the production. And so it's just another tool we have in our tool set to be able to guide and facilitate the show, to keep it safe, to keep it ethical, but also to keep the ball rolling because we're on time limit. So, you know, very important, very important.
Not forever, you only paid for the hour. Let's get going.
Exactly, yeah.
Which improves the experience for everybody. And that's interesting because in traditional theater you do have to kind of choreograph focus and pull and push focus, but it's not so much about the actor's body language or the actor's body. It's more about it's just about stage placement and movement to a certain extent to like draw the eye, but I think it's way more about like lighting and stage placement. So your choreographic landscape changes that,
exactly,
focusing on movement of both parties.
Yes, and the key with the choreographic landscape is to say that the audience is an environment too, with extra emphasis on the two, because we're not losing sight that they are people. They are people that should be respected, whose boundaries should be respected in a space. We're not using this idea to objectify them. And that's really important because, like, we could we could throw audience members into the next room. We could tug them by the arm, but that's very bad. That's not that's not great at all. And so what choreographic landscape is more saying, like, using choreography, again, these more abstract, very intentional, very mindful gestures as a way of guiding audiences in a way that is safe and rehearsed and performed. Because we don't want to assume complete control over the audience. We want to respect them. And even though immersive theater is great at being intimate, we don't want to violate someone. And so, it's very, very crucial that we don't lose sight of that.
Like, let's just clarify, guys. We don't want to violate anybody. Let's just put that one down there. So I'm going to jump to this question.
Yeah.
Because I think that, let's not violate anyone leads nicely into what I think is kind of the most important question here is what is, and you talk through all this in your thesis, so I encourage the audience to consider this the appetizer to Roby's thesis, which at the end of this I'll ask you to tell us how people can go find it and read it. But what is the current state of consent, how it's viewed and how it's navigated in immersive theater? How is it being dealt with currently?
This is great because there are some ways in which immersive theater is doing really, really well, and there are some ways in which the immersive theater is still trying to keep up, trying to find its ground, trying to establish better practices. So this is definitely why it's a part of my thesis, because it's a very current issue in immersive theater, especially in the wake of the Me Too movement and with an ever-growing consciousness about respecting audience members and consent, especially with a new genre that is doing things with audiences that no other form has done before. So we're all kind of in this boat figuring things out. But I think one of the ways in which consent sometimes is viewed negatively with an immersive theater is because sometimes it can be seen as a barrier to immersion, that state where you completely lose yourself inside this piece of fiction. You kind of forget that you're operating in a fantasy world, just like being really in tune to like a video game or really in the moment with an escape room. Everything else kind of zones out of the picture and you're focused in on this world. That's the goal of immersive theater. We want you to be in that cool state. We don't want you to lose it. And I think some practitioners fear consent a little bit because consensual practices tend to be very overt. Like, is this okay? Is this okay?
Right.
That's great. Here are the policies. Here are the rules. Don't do this, blah, 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 blah. And so sometimes that can be viewed as like a tension between this immersive state that we're trying to create and the fact that we also like want to respect people and have that active ongoing consent. Some immersive productions navigate this poorly. Essentially, they'll have an extremely detailed waiver that lists everything that could happen, and that's just treated as like the cool de facto agreement, even though the problem there is that A, nobody's sitting here reading a waiver, and
Like,
two,
whatever.
and two, that's not active and ongoing. That's a one-time agreement that someone could renege on. So yeah,
Right.
not a
If you're
great
making the
situation.
experience for the audience member, if the experience is ultimately for them, and then they sign the form, but later they're like, oh, I don't like what is happening. I don't want this to be happening to me. And you're like, well, you signed the form. You've kind of like lost track
Exactly.
of
And the
what you're doing.
problem too, because immersive theater is all about creating this illusion, it's unfortunately resulted in an environment where a lot of these productions try to be very secretive about what happens because they want those surprises. They want those cool things that you weren't expecting because that can lead to like some fun moments and you being totally wowed by something. And that's awesome. But the problem there, of course, is that people can't get a clear idea of what is actually going to happen, and therefore they cannot consent to that thing, especially when these waivers or like, websites or communications about what the experience may involve can be worded very vaguely.
Right.
And so I think that there is a current problem there in like immersive theater companies holding back too much information and not trusting their audiences enough to lose themselves inside of that info. Because that's the other thing too. There are also some immersive fans out there that don't want to know anything, that want to go into something completely blind, that want to go into these like intense like immersive horror experiences or like grueling gauntlets without any kind of warning, because they're looking for that intense sense of transformation.
Yeah.
Whereas other people want all that information. And so one of the solutions I come up with is based on some other companies where you can essentially consent to receive the detailed information about what's going to happen in a production. And so that gives agency to the audience on whether or not they want to receive that information, which I think is it's an amazing way of bridging that gap. So that if people find it valuable to not have that information for their immersion, they can do that.
Yeah, they don't have
If people want to know that they're going to be respected, that they don't need to worry about anything, they can have their information to navigate that space appropriately.
Right. And if you're the type of person who's like, no, I don't care, let's go, bruh, like, then you're probably like you're more likely to be fine and good with the things that are happening. And if you're the type of person who's like, can I please see the itinerary? Then you should probably be shown the itinerary. So that sounds like a great solution.
Yeah, especially because immersive theater likes to deal with incredibly intimate interactions.
Right.
It doesn't shy away from adult content in a lot of ways either. And it sometimes deals with really difficult subjects as well. And so, it's just like the concept of like a trigger warning. Like, there are people out there that really need to know this stuff because they need to know what to expect and how they can keep themselves safe and in a great mental state. Whereas other people who have been fortunate enough to maybe not have experienced anything so gravely, they don't have to deal with that same kind of baggage. And so, yeah, we're navigating all of that right now. It's still kind of surprising to me that immersive theater in the past hasn't been very transparent about its practices with each other. It's like almost like trade secrets. But I think we're starting to break that ice a little bit now.
Yeah, because people art's collaborative, so it's easier to do it well if you are working together and sharing. Where do you, so you talk about one of your ideas, but in terms of consent and how you want people to conceptualize it within the immersive community, where do you want to bring the conceptualization of consent? How do you want, how does your thesis argue people should look at it?
Yes, so I flip this dilemma on its head and say that instead of seeing consent mechanisms as barriers to the immersive state, that we should actually see them as enabling a better immersive state. And so for me, I see consent as a navigational tool that audiences are kind of given that make them feel empowered to take risks and to make decisions and to interact more. I feel like it's a very simple hypothesis, that if you feel safe, you're more likely to want to engage with something on a deeper level than if you don't. So, I think that's pretty understandable, right? And so if you feel like you're going to be safe, if you feel like you're going to respect it, if you feel like you can take risks in the space by like interacting with people or trying to do challenges, and a little bit where those boundaries are, that'll be very helpful. Immersive theater kind of prides itself on having fuzzy boundaries, but when you have absolutely like no boundaries, people get really scared about accidentally crossing a line and then facing the repercussions for that.
Right, and then you're reluctant to play.
Exactly. Yeah, you want to reward people for playing, even if they make a mistake. You just want to course correct, and you want to keep them going. You don't want to have like a negative slap on the wrist, especially because they don't know. You haven't told them the boundaries. So like, how are they supposed to know that like what they did was wrong? Unless it was like an egregious and insidious thing, which really doesn't often happen.
Right.
And so in that way, I also see consent as like consent mechanisms as a methodology of alignment. It's alignment between the audience and the performers who also have to worry about their autonomy being respected as well. And the creators and immersive practitioners, it's about aligning expectations and basic boundaries and basic agreements to allow for a better, more interactive experience for everyone.
Yeah. And I think that attitude is really what I want to pull from that, what we can learn from for comedy in general. Because one of the first things that I teach beginning improvisers is the audience is not going to feel comfortable unless they think you're comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not going to feel comfortable until they see the rules of the world you are creating together. So improv is this huge void, in much the same way that when you walk into an immersive experience, it's this black void of nothing, and the audience is like, I have no idea what's going to happen. But then as a performer, as an improviser, you have to work with what you're comfortable with, what your partner is comfortable with, what the audience is comfortable with, and find what is safe for all of you for comedy to happen.
Exactly. And so what I particularly do in that part of my thesis is that I look at existing mechanisms of consent in immersive theater and how we can improve them, or how we can spread them more broadly across the board to allow for better experiences. And so I already mentioned one, which was allowing audiences to consent to that particular information about like subject matter or theatrical effects that may happen, like strobes or things like that. So if people want the surprise, they can have it. If they need the peace of mind, they can have that as well. Another one, too, was setting standards of behavior. Like, what's the basic etiquette? What should you be doing, right? The genius with immersive theater is that the audiences can interact, and that's amazing. One of the problems that we had with Safe House 82 one night is that we had a group of men that took that kind of playing into the story world way too far, to the point where they were improvising with each other about their own fictionalized characters, and they were interrupting the performers. And by doing so, they were stalling the performance itself. And it was hard for our actors to put a stop to that, because their anger and frustration and them trying to clearly communicate to these people to stop doing that while remaining in character was just coming off as a character trait rather than trying to establish a boundary. Exactly. And that's a huge problem when we're trying to keep a production on track. Another thing I propose too is having a clear and non-penalizing ways of opting out, which I think is so important. And a few productions, audience members were able to opt out of actions without completely derailing the show for themselves. Unfortunately, with some immersive theater, it's like either all in or you're out and you leave the production. And that's not fun. You spent a lot of money and time to be there. Another thing too is that, you may just feel uncomfortable with one small part of the show and then not the rest of the show, or you may even change your mind. And so one example I came across was a show where the audience members wore sashes. Same with the performers too. And if anyone felt uncomfortable at any time, they would just take off their sash. And then that was essentially a hands-off rule. Like, you don't interact with that person. They're allowed to stay in the room. So they don't have to like leave. Yeah, they can watch. They can moderate themselves, right? And they can put their sash back on at any time as well. So if someone just needs to take a moment to consider if they want to participate, they can do that. And I think that's so much more healthier than saying you're all in or you're all out. Or, even if it does come down to a yes or no, you're not losing out on the rest of the entire show.
Yeah, you don't get kicked out because people are like, you didn't want to play in this exact way we wanted you to, so we're going to make you leave. that feels kind of against the
Exactly.
spirit of the thing.
Exactly. And it's
Yeah.
like, even if it isn't malicious,
Right.
right? There could just be a particularly intense moment of the show that people don't really find the need to experience, or maybe it
Yeah.
triggers something. And so, like, give them the option of taking a step back, maybe even exiting the space, and then coming
Right.
back into the show when that point's over. Like, they get it.
Yeah.
Like, you can always catch people back up to speed.
Right.
Like, just provide those options, and then that way consent is active.
Right.
And so you're making sure that your audiences feel comfortable constantly being there,
Yeah.
and your performers then feel more empowered to interact with people, because they're not so worried about whether someone is comfortable with something or not, because there's, like, in that case, there was a clear visual signifier.
Yeah.
You step in, step out, clear rules of engagement.
Yeah, and I think that it's not like that doesn't define it um, in such a way that the art form is restricted. It's finding ways to work within your concept and make people comfortable with it. Whenever I'm teaching improv, I try to take at least a class to talk about and discuss how do we do this, because there's a lot of things that are like, when you're taught improv, you're taught yes and. You have to say yes to everything. And I feel like practitioners for immersive have a similar problem of, we want to accept
Mm-hmm.
whatever the audience is. It's beautiful input, but you have to feel, you have to have those tools to be able to say no. I don't want you touching me that way. I don't want to talk about this topic in particular. And there are ways to do it. But just in comedy and performance, we ignore that so much. I think especially for
Yeah,
performers, we don't allow ourselves to set healthy boundaries, when that would
mm-hmm.
ironically make the audience more comfortable with what we are doing. If they feel like we're safe, they feel
Exactly.
happier.
Exactly. And unfortunately, that's been one of the problems that immersive theater has been having to deal with as well.